teaching for 34 years. I don't believe, really more, probably more like 44. And I don't believe I've ever taught a course in the prophets before. And that's been very much on purpose, because in the past, I've sort of found them a little boring, to tell you the truth, and not really relevant. I tend to focus on things that are relevant to our lives or to the present. And what has happened over the last year, really, and as our country has become more divided and our congregation has become more divided, is I found that the prophets kept coming up in our conversations at staff meeting, clergy meetings, in listservs with other rabbis, more and more. And here's the basic divide, and the reason they've been spoken about so often. And that's when I went back into a real deep dive for myself, because I wanted to see if people's understanding of what they were, the lessons they were learning, were really accurate. And here's the reason it became important. The big issue, besides COVID in modern day congregational life, is how political a rabbi should become. And there are those who believe that we should, as my father did, stand up for every civil rights cause and justice you shall pursue. There's some that say, Rabbi, I've got my my Fox and my CNN. Talk to me about God, but I don't really want to hear anything about politics from you. And the argument of those who are more inclined to bring social justice issues into the pulpit is that we, as Reformed Jews, are prophetic Jews, that we are in the prophetic tradition. And let me just, and they use that to mean that we are in the tradition of the prophets who stood up for social justice issues. And the reason Reformed Judaism became prophetic Judaism, however, is not exactly because of social justice. It was one of the issues, but remember the forebears who chose this term, this moniker, did so at a time when they were contrasting themselves. This is the 19th century in Europe and also here in America. They were contrasting themselves with the Orthodox. Now, they weren't called Orthodox at the time. They were just traditional Jews, but they were contrasting themselves with traditional Jews. And the way they looked at it is that the traditional Jews were like the Kohanim, like the priests, just tending to their ritual and to their minutia of piety, and not really getting the big picture of what Judaism's all about. The prophets, on the other hand, in certainly several places, say, you really shouldn't be spending all of that time on minutia. You really should be looking at the big universal pictures, a picture like taking care of the widow and the orphan and the poor and the oppressed and so on. And so when people kept bringing up that we should be like prophets, I started thinking that I really wondering to myself whether or not that's really what the prophets were all about. And I'm not going to give away the ending, but what I'll tell you is that today, for this next hour, we will be looking at the texts which do posit the prophets as the seekers of justice. And then on Thursday, at the same time, we will take a look at another view of what the prophets were really all about. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, as it turns out, people on both sides of the argument that we should be political and that we should be apolitical actually will find succor in the lives and the careers of the prophets. So it will end up, the end of the story will be, as we say in Hebrew, gamzeh v'gamzeh, this and also this, this and also its opposite. So with that, let's go to our first text. The stories of the prophets really begin in the book of Samuel. You could argue that Moses was the first prophet, but he was also the first rabbi and the first everything. So I don't really think he counts. I'm talking about prophet qua prophet. And one of the very first prophets we hear about is, okay, let me see if I can do this. There we go. Is, whoop, Okay, that's weird. Is this sounding okay still?
Yes.
Oh, it made a change on my screen. Okay. Um, and one of my favorite texts, because, and the reason it's one of my favorite texts is that when I first came to Temple Israel, um, uh, Rabbi Fromm of blessed memory had changed all of the Haftorah portions for all of the bar and bat mitzvahs. Now let me explain this. The Haftarah portion is not taken from the Torah; it's taken from usually from the prophets, sometimes from the writings, but usually taken from a book of prophets, tied together by some sort of either a word or a concept or an idea, and that's what a Haftarah is. However, a lot of the prophets use some pretty stringent, as you'll see, some pretty strident language, including, calling the people of Israel whores and all sorts of things that you wouldn't want a 12 or a 13-year-old to hear. And so Rabbi Fromm created a book with the help of Helen Gilbert of blessed memory. Some of you will remember her. Made a book of, I don't know what they were, maybe the 20 acceptable Haftorah portions, and this was one of them, Second Samuel, and there's a very dramatic moment, and Helen Gilbert, who was our tutor par excellence, would tutor the kids to say it in a very specific way, which when I get to it, I will try to replicate for you. And it was a very common occurrence at Temple because this Haftorah portion came up, every, I don't know, 4 or 5 weeks, maybe 6 weeks. Okay, so can everyone see the text, the Second Samuel?
Yep.
Okay, good. So it says that late one afternoon, David rose from his couch, this is King David, and strolled on the roof of the royal palace. And from the roof, he saw a woman bathing, probably nude. The woman was very beautiful, and the king found out that her name was Bathsheba. And she was the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So David fetched her and took her into his home and wooed her and knew her in the biblical sense, and she conceived, and when she conceived, she told King David about her dilemma, and so what David does, he says to Uriah, his officer, you should go down, leave your post tonight, go down to your house, bathe your feet, you look tired. Now, why is he doing this? Because he figures that Uriah will know his wife, and then King David will be off the hook for siring this child. By the way, this is way before DNA testing, so there was no other way to find out who the father was. Unfortunately, Uriah is a very, very conscientious officer and decides to stay with his men at the gates, if you will, the gates of the city wall. And so, oh, I thought I turned that off. Sorry about that. Come on. I turned my phone off, but it seemed to have come back on of its own accord. So he tries again. And this time he says, you know what? He gets him drunk. And he sends him home thinking, okay, now he's definitely going to have relations with his wife, and I'll be cleared of this baby gate. Unfortunately, Uriah is a very, very, very conscientious officer, or he's gay. We don't know which one, but one of the two. And he decides not to take the opportunity to go home to his wife. And at this point, and now we're at verse 14, if you want to follow along. So, apoplectic. In the morning, King David wrote a letter to Joab, general, which he sent with Uriah. And it said, and this is terrible to send this letter with the victim, place Uriah in the front line where the fighting is the fiercest, then fall back so that he may be killed. And he died. His wife lamented over, the Bible says she lamented over her husband. And then after Shiva, she went to David and became his wife and bore him a son. So that's the story. And it also says that the Lord was displeased with what David had done, as you might imagine. That's the setup for the story. But This is the part of the story that our B'nai Mitzvah read on the Bima so often when we were doing our Haftarot in in English, which we don't do as much anymore. So the Lord sent Nathan. Now Nathan is the prophet of the story. This is the hero of our story. He came to him and said, "There were two men in the same city, one rich and one poor. The rich man," he's talking to King David. He's giving him a case, if you will, a legal case. "The rich man had very large flocks and herds, but the poor man had only one little ewe lamb that he had bought. He tended it, and it grew up together with him and his children. It was his pet lamb. It used to share his morsel of bread, drink from his cup, and nestle in his bosom. It was like a daughter to him. One day a traveler came to the rich man, but he was loath to take anything from his own flocks or herds to prepare a meal for the guest who had come. So he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had visited. David flew into a rage." So the story ends. David now flies into a rage against this fictional man and says to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. He shall pay for the lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and showed no pity." And here's the line. "And Nathan said to David, 'Thou art the man.'" By the way, this was Rabbi Daniel Syme's Torah portion for his bar mitzvah, and he does the impression of it better than I do, but nonetheless, it was oft used. "Thou art the man. You're the one who stole the little lamb from the bosom of his owner, even though you're a rich man and had everything you could possibly want. Even though you're the king and could have any woman you want. You're the one that stole Uriah's wife and then did him in." And this, by the way, is where we get the idea in Judaism of speaking truth to power. There's a similar story, which we're going to skip with Elijah, who's coming up next, where Jezebel, the evil queen Jezebel, and Ahab, her husband, steal a property from a neighbor that they want, an orchard, because they and they do it by accusing him wrongfully, using false witnesses, accusing him wrongfully of treason, and he is put to death, and they get their orchard. So there's and Elijah is the one that comes to Ahab and says, "You know, thou art the man. You know, how could you do this to this poor little guy when you're the king and have all you want?" And this issue has become extremely. I mean, I was just before class reading a newspaper article talking about what's going to happen to those, for instance, in the Senate who enabled the Trump campaign to make these, what are, I think, verifiably false claims about the election being stolen. What they're saying is, whether you agree politically or not, the point is that the way they were saying, why are there so few in politics today who are willing to speak truth to power? It's a very important Jewish ideal, and a very obviously risky thing to do, but held in high regard by our tradition. Let's stop here for a minute before we go on to Elijah, one of my second favorite prophet. Ezekiel's first, but you'll get him next class. Any thoughts or arguments or suggestions about Nathan and his role as a prophet in his day? No? Anyone? Yeah, Noreen?
I don't know. Later on, with the when he makes up the story with Bathsheba,
Yeah,
about making Solomon king,
yeah.
that's a little shady.
Well, remember that King David is not able to build the temple because of his political misdeeds, and that's left for Solomon. So the Bible is very clear about the fact that David was a flawed but great leader, and of course it's under David that the empire becomes centralized and there's a certain amount of political and military power that is centered in Jerusalem. But clearly, listen, you've been studying, most of you here on this call have been studying Torah long enough and Bible long enough to know that almost all of the biblical characters are flawed. That's sort of part of the shtick, Yeah. Anyone else? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about Elijah. Elijah is the prophet you probably know best. You know him because he came to your son's bris. He comes to your Passover Seder every year. He's there at the end of every Shabbos for Havdalah. Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi. Eliyahu is like like I said, he's the prophet who's in our lives more than any of the other prophets. And basically, I really, when I first started planning this course, I gave you the whole Geschichte, the whole story, but I realized that if I read that through, you'd all be asleep by the time I was done. So let me just sort of paraphrase what has happened so far. Elijah has had many run-ins with Jezebel, the queen. And generally, one of them I talked about, it comes after this, but one of them, as I said, was when he spoke up to Ahab about his stealing this neighbor's land. But a lot of it, most of it, really comes down to Jezebel's affection for the worship of Baal. Baal, when he says you shall have no other idols before me, well, Baal was one of those idols that you may not have, and Jezebel was perverting the cult, if you will, and Elijah was standing up for basic normative Jewish practice, if you will. And there was the murder of prophet after prophet after prophet, and Elijah's now in pretty hot water. Jezebel sends out her troops to kill him, as she did the others. And this is what happens. There was Elijah in the cave, and he spent the night. Then the word of the Lord came to him. Oh, wait a minute. Am I still sharing? Yeah, I am. Okay. There was Elijah in the cave, and he spent the night. Then the word of the Lord came to him. He said to him, God said to him, "Why are you here, Elijah?" He replied, "I am moved by zeal for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to the sword. I alone am left, and they are out to take my life." So the word zeal is very important here. One of the things about prophets is they're not great compromisers. Okay, prophets are zealous for the cause, and the Hebrew is mishugal davar. They're crazy about the issue, right? They do not step down or back down. That's part of being a prophet. It says, "I alone am left, and they're out to take my life. Come out," God called, "and stand on the mountain before the Lord." And lo, the Lord passed by. There was a great and mighty wind, splitting mountains and shattering rocks by the power of the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And then, finally, well, here the phrase is translated as a soft murmuring sound. That is much less poetic than the classical translation, which is, anyone know? A still small voice. A still small voice. That's a better translation, but actually a total mistranslation. Both are a mistranslation, because the Hebrew, which I forgot to include here, my apologies. The Hebrew is kol d'mama daka. Kol does mean a voice, and daka means thin. That's why they get a soft murmuring sound, a thin voice, but that's not what it means. D'mama means silent. So it's not a still small voice. It's not a soft murmuring sound. It's not a whisper. It's a silent communication. Now, when I do poor Sheila has lived through this part of the lecture 1,000 times, because when I do my talk to the Introduction to Judaism class, I always talk about the fact that God never spoke words to anyone. This is just one of the 5 examples that I give, but God always speaks in a call to mamadaka, in silence, in messages that are communicated in other ways. The Rambam, Maimonides, makes a big deal out of it, saying, do you idiots really think that God speaks words like with a tongue? What word, what language you think God speaks? Latin or Yiddish, Hebrew, Godish, what language? No, God speaks in much more profound ways. And this is not my theology class, so I won't go any further, Sheila, I promise. Although Sheila could actually finish the paragraph for me. But it's but the important thing here is that the prophet, one of the aspects of prophecy, is that they have a direct connection, a direct communication with the Lord, with God. The only thing that's different here is that Elijah is explicit that it's a silent communication. In most of the other prophets, you'll read them saying, the Lord came to me and said, blah, 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 and use words. Here, it's very clear that it's not words, it's communication. It is a sliver of silence, a potent sliver of silence. Okay? So, why do you think Elijah was chosen for all these honors? The Seder, the bris, the what is this? Why is Elijah so popular? Any guesses? Noreen, go for it.
Well, it wasn't that he was popular. It's just that he had some lessons that needed to be learned. And that's why he needs to go see that people did want to join in the covenant and things like that.
Okay, so it's for his edification that we invite him in. Oh, okay, that's good theory. Anyone else? Why else might we have chosen this guy? Yeah, Doreen, you can unmute yourself.
Well, he stood by what he thought, and he had faith in the Lord, even though the rest of them didn't.
Yeah.
And he had to go, he even went to a cave all by himself to stand up for what he believed.
Yeah, good. I should also, there's one other, and both of those are true. One other theory is that Elijah becomes associated with the Messiah. So as a forebearer of the Messiah, and the Messiah is a forebearer of the Messianic age, and Elijah was a forebearer of the Messiah. And so all of these events, at the end of the Seder, what do we say? Next year in Jerusalem. That's back then they thought that as the Messianic age. They didn't know anything about Ben Gurion. They thought they'd be coming back at the Messianic age. A bris, that's a little Vorspice, a little sort of perfection for the world to come. So I think that also has some validity, that there's a messianic aspect to Elijah, and we bring a lot. Oh, and also Shabbat. So Havdalah, Shabbat is supposed to be a forspice of the messianic age, and in Havdalah, when we conclude it, we bring Elijah. Sort of saying, okay, guys, remember, we're really waiting for this thing to come, and we don't want it to be just Shabbat. We want it to be all the time. So anyway, that's another theory. Okay. But when you signed up for a course in the prophets, my guess is that you were thinking less about Elijah and Nathan and more about the classical prophets. And we generally think of the major prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah being the two that come to mind for most people. And Isaiah always comes to mind in Detroit because, of course, we're all Pistons fans, and we all have that connection with Isaiah Thomas. Now, Isaiah is a tough book to teach because it's really There's really not one Isaiah. There are two Isaiahs. There might be three Isaiahs. And if we wanted to do this from a scientific point of view, it would take us the whole semester, not just a half hour. We'd have to. It would take forever. But remember, what I'm trying to focus on here, on this part of on this day of this seminar today, is times when the prophets appear to be the stewards of a social justice agenda. And here is Isaiah's moment. I mean, there are others, but this is, I think, the best one for us to look at. Isaiah says, "Cry with full throat, without restraint. Raise your voice like a shofar. Declare to my people their transgression, to the house of Jacob their sin. To be sure they seek me, God, daily, eager to learn God's ways, my ways. Like a nation that does what is right, that has not abandoned the laws of its God." In other words, as they're pretending to be a nation that has done everything right, and they ask me for the right way. They are eager for the nearness of God. They go to shul. They go to the temple. They give sacrifices. They're eager for the nearness of God. Why, when we fasted, did you not see? When we starved our bodies, God, why did you pay no heed? Because, and this is God's answer, on your fast day, you see to your business and oppress all your laborers. So, when they're supposed to be in shul, fasting on Yom Kippur, they go to work, and not only that, but they misuse the people that work for them. Because, God says to them, you fast in strife and contention. In other words, you give someone the finger in the parking lot outside of Temple Israel. You fight among yourselves at the break fast or at the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Some of you can relate to some of these things. Here we go. And you strike with a wicked fist, that you beat your children or your God forbid, or your wife, God forbid. Is such the fast I desire, a day for men to starve their bodies? That you think Israelites, that's what I'm looking for, just so that you should fast and then everything will be hunky-dory? Is it bowing the head like a bulrush and lying in sackcloth and ashes? Do you call that a fast? A day when the Lord is favorable? No. This is the fast I desire, to unlock fetters of wickedness and you untie the cords of the yoke. Important line. Who is put into a yoke? Oxen or slaves?
Slaves.
Right? Okay? To let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke. It is to share your bread with the hungry, and to take the wretched poor into your home. When you see the naked, to clothe him, and not to ignore your own kin. This is probably the quintessential prophetic text, exclaiming that Reformed Judaism, that Judaism is not about ritual. It's not about just going through the motions. It's about the ideas behind the rituals. And those ideas are justice, peace, taking care of those less fortunate. This is where our forebears got the idea that Judaism that prophetic Judaism is not about ritual, it's about action. Got it?
Right.
Okay. Isaiah makes the case as clearly as I think it could be made. The Jeremiah text is not as strong, I don't think. But I wanted to give you a sense that it's not, that there are other major prophets who have this same point of view. So this is God again. Remember, the prophets, why are you a prophet? You're a prophet because you talk directly to God. That's what makes you a prophet. You can, and therefore, in some cases, we'll see next week, you can see the future. Okay. For among my people, God's people, are found wicked men, wicked people who lurk, like fowlers lying in wait. They set up a trap to catch men. In other words, they're trying to entrap people in their schemes. As a cage is full of birds, so their houses are full of guile. That is why they have grown so wealthy. So basically, they're cheaters, right? I don't know if you've been looking at the newspapers lately about what's happening with retail trading on the stock exchange. Has anyone been looking at that? It's really fascinating. And that's what he's sort of saying, like, you're cheating in the stock market. They have become fat and sleek. They pass beyond the bounds of wickedness, and they prosper. They will not judge the case of the orphan, no, nor give a hearing to the plea of the needy. Shall I not punish such deeds, says the Lord? Shall I not bring retribution on a nation such as this? An appalling, horrible thing has happened in the land. The prophets prophesy falsely. That's really bad. And the priests rule accordingly. And my people like it so. But what will you do at the end of it? So here he's really bringing into question not only the priests, but even the prophets here are being called into question in terms of their ethical behavior. So again, I don't want to leave this until we understand the point that Reformed Judaism looks to texts like these and says, let's not worry about phylacteries. Let's not worry about binding them as a sign upon our hand, but let's worry about actually doing them with our hands. Let's not put them on a literal box in front of our eyes. Let's worry about them always being in front of our mind. That's how Reformed Judaism reinterprets ritual, and as a result, you get what we call classical Reformed Judaism: no kippot, no talis, no phylacteries, etc., etc., etc. Yes, Karen.
Well, it sounds like we're kind of slamming anyone who has more conservative or traditional rituals. There are probably very many good people who do the same things and are identified by what they put on when they pray. But I think it gets back to when you have the time between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur to make amends, that it can't be just to God, which is like praying, but it has to be person to person. So you have to do good for the world, but also good in your own world. So that would apply to any Jew of any persuasion or a acculturated Jew.
Absolutely.
And that would be more inclusive, because I think that social justice is what every Jew feels. I don't think that it's a cognitive thing, that just stays with one group. I think that we all share that. Yeah,
and certainly Reformed Judaism has embraced many of the, not all, but many of the rituals that it. But remember, when you break away from an orthodoxy, it's not so easy to just do it, incrementally. Sometimes you have to do it and I think, and again, I'm not a classical Reform rabbi, so I can't speak for them, but I think what they would answer you is that it's very difficult to be both particularistic and universalistic at the very same time. And if you're just worried, if you're just worried about the picayune, little ways of being holy, you may forget about what holiness is really all about. But like I said, Reformed Judaism has come a long way from there. But this is the moment when we labeled ourselves Prophetic Judaism, because they were breaking away and they were saying, no, we're not going to lay tefillin, because we think that that's a misunderstanding of the spirit of the text.
Well, I think also because I was conservative before I was whatever I am now.
Yeah.
But that I think that Reform Jews really can think on their own. They don't go to clergy to necessarily ask everything they have to do. And a lot of very religious people always check with their rabbi. And I think being able to own your own feelings and make your own decisions gives you a lot of freedom to do more things that might be outside the box. In terms of social justice or accepting other people.
Definitely. You never want to make aspersions to any group, but let me give you one example, though, that I think is a very clear one and very factual, and it has to do with the kashrut industry. So the kashrut industry is a fairly corrupt industry, both in terms of, and this is not, you just go read the newspapers. This is not any kind of news. But the story that that gets me the most is so the idea of kashrut. All of the from the Rambam down are very clear that the reason we have these rituals is to avoid cruelty to animals. Bal tashchid, it's called. That we do these. We for instance, the knife of the shochet has to be very, very sharp without a single nick in it. And the way that they cut the along the animal's neck, along the jugular, is a way that, according to our rabbis, our tradition, is meant to that the animal will die such a quick death that there'll be no pain. And it's important that the blood, because kosher meat is void of blood. It's important that the blood. I hate to do this to you before dinner, I'm sorry, but it's important that the blood is drained. So in the major, all of the major kashrut slaughterhouses, what they started doing, because of that last technical problem of the blood draining, is that they would take chains and that they would wrap them around the cow's legs, and then in one swell swoop, they would turn the cow. They would lift the cow off the ground by its legs, cut the neck at that moment, and that way it made it easier for them to drain all the blood. But of course, terrifying the animal in the process and doing exactly the opposite of what the intention of the halakha is. And I think what Isaiah was trying to say is, look, don't tell me you're keeping the letter of the law. If you're not keeping the spirit of the law, in the case of kashrut, the spirit of the law is bal tashchit. It's that we should not be causing pain to an animal. Then you are not a religious person, and your actions are not being accepted by me as God. And by the way, that's not Reform Judaism speaking. That's the prophet Isaiah, or actually God through the prophet Isaiah. So, it's not that there was a beautiful picture. I don't know if you saw it on Facebook of Cantor Smolash laying tefillin with his son Cedar for the first time after his bar mitzvah. Beautiful, beautiful, meaningful moment. And Reform Judaism believes you should study all the traditions and figure out which ones do have a connection to spirituality and ethics, and embrace all of those. So it's not that you can't do rituals and be ethical. It's that if the performance of the rituals obscures your vision of what they call ta'amei ha-mitzvot, the reason behind the mitzvot, that would be a problem for prophetic Judaism. Okay, and the case of the cow, I think, is about as good an example of that as I could possibly give. Okay. Oh, we only have 20 minutes, not even. Okay. Well, I think we're on our last sheet for today, so I think we're going to be okay. And although that Isaiah text is clearly iconic in terms of this issue, it's actually the minor prophets who are most well known as social justice champions. So let's just do a few of them, really two of the minor prophets, and see what they have to say. The Amos, I apologize for the Amos text. It's a very long text, and it's very poetic because it keeps going. It uses the same terminology of "Thus said the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel, for 4 I will not revoke it," which is the curse. And it goes over and over with the same, and it's sort of hypnotic and beautiful. But again, it would take us a half hour to go through. So if you're interested, take a look at Amos chapter 2. You can go through the whole chapter in 10 minutes. But I'm trying to give you the best of Amos, if you will. So the God is saying that for 3 transgressions of Israel, I would revoke it, but for 4, no way. You guys are screwed, basically, is what he's saying, because you're such sinners. Because they have sold for silver those whose cause was just. So in other words, as lawyers, as judges, they took bribes. And the needy for a pair of sandals. So, someone gave them a pair of shoes and they ruled against someone who was poor. You trample the heads of the poor into the dust of the ground and make the humble walk a twisted course. In other words, basically putting a stumbling block before the blind. Having a handicapped person have to go the long way around is what they're saying. Father and son go to the same girl and thereby profane my holy name. That's, I don't, I don't even want to think about what that one is. They recline by every altar on garments taken in pledge. Oh, I should explain that one. When you lent someone money, if you needed security, they would take your garments. The problem with that is garments were very, very, very expensive. People didn't own wardrobes. You had a garment because they were very labor intensive and very difficult to make. And so when you took someone's garment in pledge, you're really taking what will keep them warm and safe. And so what they did is they're saying they recline, imagine a couch just strewn with these garments that they're using as pillows instead of letting the poor person actually have his clothing against the rain and the cold. And drink in the house of their god wine bought with fines they imposed. Misusing the tax code, if you will, of the church, of the cult, the temple, in order to enjoy an orgy of indulgence. So that's Amos. Micah is probably the quintessential fighter for justice. And he says, I said, listen, you rulers of Jacob. This is now the rulers of Jacob. So he's going out against the priests and the high class. You chiefs of the house of Israel, for you ought to know what is right, but you hate good and love evil. You have devoured my people's flesh. You have flayed the skin off them and their flesh off their bones. And after tearing their skins off them and their flesh off their bones and breaking their bones to bits, you have cut it up into a pot like meat in a cauldron. He's basically saying that their sins are so terrible against other people that they're akin to cannibalism. Pretty horrific sort of language. But the final text, and this is the one you all know. Again, we use it at Temple very often. Micah says, this is just a little bit later in the book, 3 chapters later. With what shall I approach the Lord, do homage to God on high? Shall I approach the God with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? This is a very rich, sort of offering. Would the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with myriads of streams of oil for the sacrifice? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, child sacrifice, the fruit of my body for my sins? No, God says. God has told you, I have told you, O man, what is good and what the Lord requires of you, only to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. So justice, humility, and mercy are what God requires of us, not the sacrifices and this is again, Karen, why again, because this is a class on the prophets, why the prophets would disagree with you a little bit and say they were definitely were attacking those who were ritually oriented. And I think the idea there that power corrupts. If power corrupts, then absolute power corrupts absolutely. And in those days, the priests were those with the money and the power. Why? Because 3 times a year, all Israelites, according to the book of Deuteronomy, all Israelites would have to make the Aliyah up to Jerusalem for the pilgrimage festivals, and that gave the authorities the chances to tax them essentially. Good. First of all, before I go with my big ending and hopefully get you excited to come back on Thursday, any questions or issues or comments or worries or anything? I hopefully we'll end in about 5-10 minutes, but there's time for questions. Yeah, go ahead, Karen.
So I never hear about the prophets having families. Do they kind of leave and become like politicians in DC, or,
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yes, most of them are nomadic, sort of wanderers who run around and make trouble, if you will. So no, I don't know of any story of the prophets having wives and children. They are the quintessential muckrakers.
So then, just to be challenging,
Mm-hmm.
Then they're almost like priests, where they do family counseling and they don't have families.
Yeah, well, I look, the Catholic Church made a decision. By the way, it wasn't Jesus. Matter of fact, I'm reading a book right now about Jesus' family. It's an interesting novel. But in any case, the Catholic Church made the decision for abstinence based on a false reading of their own testaments. And it clearly has not worked out. I don't even want to get into what the connection is between celibacy and child molestation and all of those horrible things. I'm not an expert in that, but what they were by using celibacy and poverty and so on, they were able to create a workforce
Right.
which was able to do the bidding of the church at a very cut rate. When you have a rabbi whose 2 children got married in a year, you actually have to pay him a living wage, or he can't have a chuppah. So it's and also, frankly, it wasn't. I don't know how to say this politically correctly. When I was coming up, my children will tell you that they got short shrift. At the time, some of you remember, we were a large congregation with only 2 rabbis, and we were working 70 hours a week. And I saw my kids at 10 o'clock at night when I came home, and gave them a kiss, and that was it. And that was most nights. We've come a long way, and I think that the younger clergy, although they work very, very, very hard, but clearly they are not as idiotic as Harold and I were, and they do insist on having time with their families, and not enough, but we've realized that you can't be a good rabbi and not be a good person, and part of being a good person is being a good parent. So I think Temple has come a long way in that issue. Not long enough, maybe not far enough, but we certainly are trying. Anyone else? Okay, so here's the big flourish. So when I was in rabbinical school, there was a young man who I think unfortunately just passed away, or is very ill. I can't remember. In my class, he had been a lawyer. He was very smart, very conservative, and very orthodox from a Reform Jew, and we had lots of debates in classes. And finally, our fellow student, I was a fairly good debater, and he was excellent. And finally, my classmates set up a debate that was prophet versus priest. And I, of course, took the role of the prophet, and he took the priestly role. And and the question was, what should a rabbi be? More of a prophet or more of a priest, tending to people's pastoral needs and so on, or are we prophets who are supposed to change the world? And And I think to some extent I still see myself in the prophetic role, but I will say that 34 years in the pulpit has changed me in many ways, and one of the ways is that I think I've come to understand that if we're prophets all the time, Joan Baez said it best. She said, "A martyr is a nuisance to live with at home." And, that if we're prophets all the time, we really don't we don't really meet people's pastoral needs as well as we should. And here's where next week is going to be, no, not next week, Thursday is going to be very important. Because it turns out that the prophets are not all about justice and taking care of the poor and speaking truth to power. I would say, and this, I'm going to argue next time, that their main theme, their number one concern, was keeping the people Israel together. And I'll try to show you how that works. And that brings us right back to our clergy meetings at Temple Israel, when we're deciding, how far should we make a statement about Black Lives Matter? Should we make a statement about what's going on with the riot at the attack on the Capitol? Should we make a statement in this area, that area, and how do we do it, and what's the process, and what are the boundaries, and if we do it, what does that do for in this case Republicans in our congregation, who we want to feel comfortable and be part of, feel that they can come to Temple as a beloved and welcome member of our family. And what's been funny, I would say that among the clergy, I have become, from being probably the most fiery of us, to being the one most concerned about the feelings of people who disagree with me. And part of it has been, believe it or not, my deeper study of the prophets and what their actual concerns were. So with that, I'm going to hopefully dangle that out to you as a little bit of a bait to come back for the next class. I think what I've taught you today, anyone teaching the prophets would have taught you. What I'm going to teach you next time is definitely, I think, going to be a little bit more surprising. So with that, I am not a prophet nor a son of the prophet, but I can see into the future, at least 2 days, and I'm hoping that every one of you will be here on the screen, and we'll have another scintillating hour together. And with that, let me thank you for being here with me.
Thank you.
You.
Okay, see you next time.
Thank you, Rabbi.